She drove the blade into the table, and the entire ballroom went silent. Not a gasp or a scream, just the kind of silence that crawls under your skin and stays there. Lady Octavia Crane stood at the centre of the grand hall, her hand still pressed flat against the hilt of the dagger, her eyes locked on the Duke of Ashmere across the room. The candlelight caught the fire in her gaze, and every lord, every lady, every powdered wig and polished monocle in that room turned to watch. The Duke did not flinch. That was the most terrifying thing of all, because 12 months ago this woman had arrived at his estate as his bride, quiet, overlooked, chosen specifically because no one would notice when she disappeared. He had married her to erase her, to use her name, drain her family's fortune, and discard her like a torn letter. He had chosen wrong. Octavia did not disappear. She did not weep quietly in a corridor or fade into the wallpaper the way he had planned. Instead, she learned. She watched. She moved through London's most dangerous circles, like smoke through a keyhole, and she gathered every secret, every debt, every dark deal the Duke of Ashmere had ever buried. And now she was standing in his own ballroom, at his own party, in front of his allies, his investors, and the one woman he truly loved, who was not his wife, holding proof of everything he had done. She pulled a folded letter from her glove and held it up. "Your Grace," Octavia said, her voice as calm as still water.
Your Grace, I believe this belongs to you.
Along with your reputation.
Along with your reputation. I will be keeping both tonight.
The Duke's jaw tightened. And for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in London looked afraid of his own wife. Now, before we go any further into this story, tell me this. Did you think Octavia was going to go down quietly? Drop your answer in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. It genuinely means the world to this channel. And if a woman rising from silence into power is the kind of story that moves you, please hit the subscribe button right now. There is so much more coming, and you do not want to miss a single moment of it. The wedding took place on a Thursday, not a Saturday, not a Sunday with flowers and singing and half of London watching from the church steps. A Thursday, grey sky, thin rain, and a ceremony so quiet that even the priest looked like he wanted to be somewhere else. Octavia Crane stood at the altar of Street Bartholomew's Chapel in a gown that had belonged to her mother, her hands folded in front of her, her face arranged into the kind of stillness that people often mistook for peace. She was not peaceful. She was calculating. Even then, even at 18, standing beside a man she had met exactly twice before this moment, she was watching everything. The Duke of Ashmere, Lord Dorian Ashcroft, stood beside her like a monument. Tall, dark-haired, jaw carved from something harder than stone. He was 31 years old, and already the most feared man in 3 counties. He had a fortune, a title, an estate that stretched so far you could ride for an hour and still be on his land. He also had debts he kept hidden, enemies he kept closer, and a plan he had not shared with anyone except his solicitor and his oldest friend, Lord Percival Galt. The plan was simple: marry Octavia Crane, the only daughter of the late Baron Crane, to access her inheritance, use the estate as collateral for his Eastern trade investments, and once the money was secured, have the marriage quietly annulled on grounds he would manufacture himself. She would be sent away, somewhere cold and distant, a cottage in Scotland perhaps, far enough that she would not be seen, not be heard, and eventually not be remembered. He had chosen her because she had no mother, no brothers, no powerful uncles. Her father had died 8 months ago and left behind a beautiful property, a modest fortune, and one daughter who had spent most of her life reading books in a library and attending no social events of consequence. She had no allies, no voice in society. She was, as Percival had described her, perfectly erasable. Dorian had agreed. What neither of them had accounted for was the look in her eyes when she signed the marriage register. Not nervousness, not hope, something quieter and far more dangerous. The look of someone who already knew the game being played and had decided to play it better. She saw the way Dorian's solicitor handed him a folded document the moment the ceremony ended. She saw the way Dorian tucked it into his coat without looking at her. She saw the way Percival Galt, standing near the back of the chapel, gave Dorian a small nod that meant everything had gone according to plan. Octavia saw all of it. She said nothing. She smiled at the priest, accepted a thin congratulation from the housekeeper who had been pulled in as a witness, and walked out of the chapel on her husband's arm into the grey Thursday rain. The carriage ride to Ashmere Hall was 40 minutes of silence. Dorian spent it looking out the window. Octavia spent it memorizing his profile, the set of his shoulders, the way his left hand drummed once against his knee when he thought no one was watching. A nervous habit. Interesting. Ashmere Hall was enormous and cold. Not cold in temperature, though it was that too, but cold in the way that houses become when no one inside them has laughed in a long time. The butler, a stiff man named Mr. Aldous Fitch, greeted them at the door with the enthusiasm of someone attending a funeral. The housekeeper, Mrs. Portia Grimes, was warmer, round-faced and sharp-eyed, and she looked at Octavia with something that might have been pity. Octavia did not want pity. She wanted information. Her rooms were in the east wing, separated from Dorian's by an entire corridor and 2 locked doors. She unpacked her own trunk because the maid assigned to her, a nervous young girl named Betsy, kept dropping things and apologizing. Octavia told her to sit down and stop apologizing. Betsy blinked at her, like no one had ever said something kind without wanting something in return. "How long have you worked here?" Octavia asked, hanging her own dresses. 3 years, my lady. And before me, was there a previous Duchess? Betsy hesitated, a very loud hesitation. There was a lady, she said carefully. Miss Lenora Voss, but she was not the Duchess. She was a guest. She came often. How often? Another hesitation. Very often, my lady. Octavia nodded, as if this was unremarkable information. Inside, she filed it away, with the precision of a woman who had spent her whole life organizing things no one else thought worth keeping. Lenora Voss. A name. A thread. She pulled it gently and waited to see what would unravel. That first week at Ashmere Hall passed in a specific kind of loneliness. Dorian was gone most mornings before she rose, and returned late enough that she had already taken supper alone. He was civil when they crossed paths. The way a man is civil to a piece of furniture, he is being careful not to scratch before he sells it. He asked if her rooms were comfortable. She said yes. He asked if she needed anything. She said no. He nodded and moved on, and the conversation died the way small fires do when no one feeds them. But Octavia was feeding something else entirely. She found the library on her 3rd day and nearly wept with gratitude. 3 walls of books, a fireplace, and a writing desk positioned beneath the east window. She also found, tucked behind a volume of Greek philosophy that had clearly never been opened, a small leather journal that did not belong to the library's collection. It was not Dorian's handwriting. She recognized it after a moment. She had seen estate ledgers, business correspondence, delivery manifests. This was an accountant's hand, tight and precise. It was a record of transactions, properties, names, and amounts. And on the 3rd page, she found her own name. Crane Estate, valued at £12,000. Transfer of deed pending matrimonial settlement. Her inheritance, already assessed, already earmarked. She closed the journal, replaced it exactly where she had found it, and went to dinner with a smile so composed it could have been painted on. 3 days later, she found the 2nd thing. She had taken to walking the grounds in the early morning, partly because she liked the air, and partly because the staff moved more freely before the house fully woke, and free-moving staff talked. She had befriended 2 of the groundsmen, a wiry older man called Thomas Wick, and his younger assistant, a talkative boy of 20 named Sam Ellery, who had opinions about everything and the sense to keep most of them quiet around the Duke, but not around the new Duchess, who actually listened. It was Sam who mentioned, entirely without realizing the weight of what he was saying, that there was a cottage on the northeast edge of the estate, near the old mill, that had been quietly repaired and restocked 3 weeks before the wedding. Repaired for what? Octavia asked, keeping her voice casual. Sam shrugged. His Grace had Mrs. Grimes arrange it. Clean linens, firewood, basic stores. I figured maybe a tenant, but no one's moved in. It's just sitting there. It's moved in. A cottage. Repaired before the wedding, stocked and waiting. Her cottage. The one he planned to send her to. Octavia finished her walk at a perfectly normal pace. She returned to the house, ate breakfast, and wrote 3 letters. One to her father's old solicitor in Bath, a man named Mr. Cornelius Webb, who had handled the Crane estate affairs for 20 years and owed her father several personal debts of gratitude. One to a woman named Lady Prudence Fairfax, a widow of formidable reputation and broader connections, who had once told Octavia's mother that if her daughter ever needed anything, she had only to write. And one to a man whose name she had found in the journal, listed as a counterparty to one of Dorian's more interesting transactions, a merchant banker named Mr. Silas Dray, whose involvement in the Eastern trade scheme raised questions she intended to have answered. She sealed all 3 and gave them to Sam Ellery to post, not through the house, but directly at the village post office. Then she waited. She was very good at waiting. The reply from Mr. Cornelius Webb arrived 11 days later, tucked inside a parcel of books he had sent as cover. He was cautious, old Cornelius. She had always respected that about him. He confirmed what she already suspected. The deed transfer for Crane Estate had been submitted for processing 2 days after the wedding. It had been filed through an intermediary firm she did not recognize, one with no public address and only a box number. Dorian had moved fast, faster than she had expected. She also had, by then, received word from Lady Prudence Fairfax. Lady Prudence was 64 years old, had outlived 2 husbands and one very dramatic scandal involving a Foreign Office minister, and currently operated what polite society called a salon, and what it actually was, a gathering place for London's most well-informed women. Titled Widows, Ambitious Merchants' Wives, the Occasional Foreign Diplomat's Companion. Women who sat in the background of powerful rooms and remembered everything. Lady Prudence's reply was 3 pages long, written in a hand so sharp it nearly cut the paper, and it told Octavia everything she needed to know about the Duke of Ashmere's finances, reputation, and the woman named Lenora Voss. Lenora Voss was not simply a frequent guest. She was the daughter of a minor baron from the north, educated, charming, and deeply inconvenient, because she was the woman Dorian actually wanted to marry. He had been attached to her for 4 years. The problem, according to Lady Prudence, was that Lenora Voss had no money. Her family estate was mortgaged. Her father was in debt to 3 separate creditors. She was beautiful and clever and completely useless to a man who needed capital to save a failing trade investment. So Dorian had done what powerful men do when they want something they cannot afford. He had married someone else to pay for it. Octavia was the transaction. Lenora was the reward. And there it was, clear as cold water. Octavia sat with this information for exactly 1 evening. She allowed herself that. 1 evening of sitting by the fire in the library, staring into the flames, and feeling the specific kind of grief that comes not from love lost, but from dignity insulted. She was not heartbroken over Dorian. She had never been given the chance to feel anything for him. She was furious, quietly, completely, and productively furious. By morning, she had a plan. The 3rd letter, the one to Silas Dray, had not yet received a reply, and she began to understand why when Mrs. Portia Grimes, the housekeeper, appeared at her door one afternoon with a look on her face that had shifted from the original pity into something closer to reluctant respect. "My lady," Portia said, closing the door behind her, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I am telling you because your mother once helped my sister when no one else would, and I do not forget that kind of thing." Octavia set down her book. "Sit down, Mrs. Grimes." Portia sat. She folded her hands. She took a breath. "Mr. Dre is not a man you can write to freely," she said. "His correspondence is watched. He and his Grace had a falling out 6 weeks ago, before the wedding, over money that was promised and not delivered. Mr. Dre believes he is owed 40% of the Eastern trade venture. His Grace believes Mr. Dre is owed nothing, because the contract they signed was drafted by His Grace's own solicitor and contains language that can be interpreted 2 ways. Mr. Dre has been looking for someone to help him build a case, and now he is being watched because His Grace does not want him talking." Octavia was very still. "How do you know this?" Portia allowed herself a small, dry smile. "Mr. Fitch, the butler, has a brother who works for Mr. Dre's household, and Mr. Fitch tells me things because I have known him since we were both in service at a different house 20 years ago, and because he is not as loyal to His Grace as he pretends to be. An alliance, right there in her own house. Octavia had not even had to build it. It had been waiting for her. She leaned forward. "Is there a safe way to reach Mr. Dre?" "There is," Portia said. "Through a woman named Mrs. Harriet Soane. She runs a lending library on Clement Street. Mr. Dre uses it as a message point. His Grace does not know about it." Octavia memorized the name and address in one pass. She did not write it down. The following week, she asked Dorian, over one of their rare shared meals, if she might begin attending some of the local social engagements, as she was finding the isolation difficult. She made her voice sound soft and slightly lost when she said it. She watched his eyes flicker with something between relief and calculation. He had expected her to either fight or collapse. A wife who politely asked permission and seemed to want nothing more than morning calls and charity luncheons was very easy to manage. "Of course," he said. "Mrs. Grimes will arrange the carriage." "You are very kind," Octavia said. He believed her. That was the first real mistake he made in her presence. The second was bringing Lenora Voss to the estate. She arrived on a Tuesday, introduced as an old family friend who came to stay for a fortnight. Dorian's manner changed the moment she stepped through the door. The hardness left his jaw. His eyes went warm. He laughed at something she said in the entrance hall, a real laugh, not the controlled sound he occasionally produced in company, and Octavia, watching from the top of the staircase, felt the full picture settle into focus. Lenora Voss was genuinely beautiful, dark-eyed, graceful, with the kind of natural warmth that made rooms feel lighter. Octavia did not hate her. It was not Lenora who had drawn up the plan. It was not Lenora who had selected a wife the way you select a tool for a job and then planned to discard her. Still, having her in the house was its own particular kind of trial. That evening, Octavia dressed for dinner with more care than usual, not for Dorian, not to compete with Lenora. She dressed carefully because she had decided that from this point forward, every room she entered would know she had chosen to enter it. She came downstairs and took her seat at the head of the table because she was the Duchess of Ashmere and that chair was hers. Lenora sat to Dorian's right. She was gracious and warm and made pleasant conversation. Dorian sat between them, and Octavia watched him navigate the specific discomfort of a man caught between what he had purchased and what he actually wanted. She smiled throughout dinner. She asked Lenora thoughtful questions. She was the perfect hostess. And under the table, She was composing the message she would send to Mrs. Harriet Soane in the morning. The meeting with Silas Dray happened 12 days later. Octavia had told the carriage driver she wished to visit the lending library on Clement Street for some new volumes. She arrived, browsed 2 shelves with genuine interest, and when the woman behind the counter, compact, grey-haired, with the alert eyes of someone who trusted no one by habit, asked if she could help her find something specific, Octavia said, "I am looking for the Dray collection. I believe it is kept in the back." Mrs. Harriet Soane looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and led her through a narrow door into a small room lined with more books and one other occupant. Silas Dray was not what she had expected. She had imagined a merchant banker to be florid and loud. Instead, he was thin, pale, somewhere in his late 40s, with the careful manner of a man who had been burned before and learned the exact temperature of fire. He stood when she entered. He looked at her with recognition, though they had never met. "Lady Ashmere," he said. "Mr. Dray," she replied. She sat without waiting to be invited. "I understand we have a mutual problem. I propose we address it mutually." He studied her. She let him look. She had nothing to hide and no performance to give, just facts and a proposition. "You have a contract that damages you," she said. "I have access to the estate's internal correspondence. I have found a journal that documents the financial structure of the Eastern trade venture in a way that your original agreement contradicts. If that journal were to reach the right legal hands, the interpretation of your contract becomes significantly more favourable." Dray was quiet for a moment. "What do you want in return?" "I want the transfer of my inheritance reversed," she said. "And I want documentation of every agreement your firm made with the Duke of Ashmere, in full, with dates and amounts, everything." Dray looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating something he thought he had already understood. "You are not what I expected," he said. "No one ever is," Octavia replied. "Do we have an arrangement?" He extended his hand. She shook it. Outside, London was beginning its afternoon noise, carriages and vendors, and the thousand small sounds of a city moving through its day. Octavia stepped out of the lending library onto Clement Street and breathed the air in slowly. Something had shifted. She could feel it in the way the afternoon sat against her skin, heavier and brighter at once. She was no longer waiting. She was moving. And somewhere across the city, in a club on St. James's Street, the Duke of Ashmere was sitting with Percival Galt drinking brandy, entirely confident that his quiet, bookish, friendless wife was at home in the East Wing, reading. He had no idea. And that, more than anything, was what she had been counting on. The thing about power is that it does not announce itself. It builds quietly, in back rooms and borrowed carriages, and conversations that no one thinks to record, until one morning the people who were supposed to be in control find themselves standing on ground that is no longer solid. Octavia had been at Ashmere Hall for exactly 6 weeks when the ground began to move. It started with Lord Percival Galt. Percival was Dorian's oldest friend, the kind of friend who had been present for every bad decision and helped engineer half of them. He was charming in the way that men who have never been told no tend to be charming, easy with laughter, loose with promises, and absolutely convinced that the world existed to accommodate him. He visited the estate regularly, stayed for days at a time, and treated Octavia with the cheerful dismissiveness of a man who had already been told she did not matter. What Percival did not know was that his own valet, a young Frenchman named René Colbert, who had come over with him from Paris 3 years ago, was quietly miserable in English service. René sent portions of his wages home every month to a sick mother in Lyon. Octavia had learnt this through Sam Ellery, who had heard it from the kitchen staff. She had then arranged, through Mr. Cornelius Webb in Bath, for a small anonymous payment to be made directly to the mother's physician in Lyon. No note, no name, just the money, arriving when it was most needed. René Colbert began leaving Percival's correspondence slightly less sealed than it had been before. It was not blackmail. Octavia was very precise about this in her own mind. She had helped someone who was suffering. What that person chose to do with his gratitude was entirely his own business. She simply made herself available to receive whatever came her way. What came her way was extraordinary. The letters between Dorian and Percival were not merely damning in their content, they were damning in their tone. The casual cruelty of two men who believed themselves completely unwatched. In one letter, Dorian referred to Octavia as the placeholder. In another, Percival described marriage as the most economical solution to a problem that would otherwise have required actual effort. There were references to the annulment timeline, a figure of 8 months, after which Dorian intended to have the marriage dissolved on grounds of incompatibility of character. A phrase his solicitor had apparently confirmed was vague enough to be useful. There were references to Lenora, warm and private, the kind of words a man writes when he believes only one person will ever read them. And there were references to a third party that Octavia had not encountered before, a name, Lord Hamish Grendel. Lord Grendel was, according to the letters, a senior member of the Board of Trade. He had connections to the licensing authority that oversaw Eastern commerce routes, and he had apparently agreed, in exchange for a sum that was not specified but described as significant, to accelerate the approval of Dorian's Eastern trade venture in a way that bypassed the standard review process. It was not merely financial manipulation, it was corruption at a level that had government threads running through it. Octavia read the relevant letters twice. Then she folded them with care, replaced them exactly as she had found them, and sat very quietly for several minutes thinking about what she now held in her hands. She was no longer dealing with a dishonest husband. She was dealing with a network. She needed someone who understood networks. Lady Prudence Fairfax arrived in London the following Thursday for her seasonal salon, which ran through the winter months and drew the kind of guests who never appeared on any official guest list, but shaped half the decisions that did. Octavia had written ahead. Lady Prudence had replied with a single line, "Come on Friday. Bring nothing you are not prepared to leave behind." Octavia arrived at Lady Prudence's townhouse on Cavendish Square on a cold Friday morning, and was shown directly into a sitting room where 5 women were already gathered. She had expected Lady Prudence alone. She stood in the doorway and assessed the room in the time it took to take one breath. Lady Prudence herself, seated nearest the fire, silver-haired and upright as a flagpole. Beside her, a woman introduced as Mrs. Cordelia Ames, the wife of a senior Treasury official, with ink-stained fingers and a ledger open on her knee. Across from her, Miss Daphne Strayle, young, perhaps 25, with the focused calm of someone trained in a discipline requiring patience, who turned out to be a cartographer's assistant and the person through whom half of London's land survey documents passed before being filed. Next to Daphne, a woman called Lady Gwen Thurston, a baroness in her own right by inheritance, with legal standing in 3 property disputes currently before the courts, and a barrister brother who owed her more than he liked to admit. And in the corner, quiet and watchful, a woman Octavia recognized after a moment as Mrs. Inez Alcott, whose late husband had been the private secretary to 2 consecutive foreign ministers, and who had retained every document she was never officially supposed to have seen. 5 women, each one a door into a different room of London's power structure. Octavia sat down. "Tell us everything," Lady Prudence said. "From the beginning, leave out nothing." So she did. She spoke for nearly an hour. She described the wedding, the journal, the cottage, the letters, Silas Dray, René Colbert, and Lord Hamish Grendel. She laid it all out with the same precision she used to organise her father's library, everything in order, nothing wasted. When she finished, the room was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then Mrs. Cordelia Ames said, "Grendel, I knew it. My husband has been watching that man for 2 years." Lady Gwen Thurston said, "The property transfer for Crane Estate can be legally challenged. I know the statute. It was filed through an intermediary firm, which means it can be questioned on grounds of proper representation." Miss Daphne Strayle said nothing, but opened a small notebook and began writing. Mrs. Innes Alcott looked at Octavia with steady, measuring eyes. The Eastern trade venture, the licensing approval. If Grendel accelerated it improperly, there will be a record somewhere in the ministry files. Those files do not disappear. They only get buried. I know where they bury things. Lady Prudence said nothing at all. She simply looked at Octavia with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something better than one. It was recognition. The look of a woman who had spent 40 years doing exactly what Octavia was now beginning to do, and who was very glad to see it happening again in someone young enough to take it further. Octavia felt something settle in her chest. Not comfort exactly, more like the feeling of a key turning in a lock that has been stuck for a very long time. She was not alone anymore. Over the next 3 weeks, the 6 of them worked with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that noise was the enemy of results. Mrs. Cordelia Ames passed information about Grendel's financial disclosures to her husband through a channel that kept Octavia's name entirely out of it, framing it as an anonymous tip from a source within the trade community. Lady Gwen Thurston filed a formal legal query about the Crane Estate deed transfer, citing procedural irregularities, which was enough to freeze the processing of the transfer without requiring a full court challenge yet. Miss Daphne Strayle produced, from her professional records, a set of land survey documents showing that 2 parcels within the eastern trade route had been surveyed under false credentials, which connected directly to the licensing approval Grendel had fast-tracked. And Mrs. Innes Alcott found the buried ministry file. It was a ledger of informal approvals, the kind of document that should never have existed in written form, and existed only because some junior clerk had been too conscientious to leave the process unrecorded. It listed Grendel's involvement, the date, the amount received, and the name of the venture it had benefited from. The Duke of Ashmere's Eastern Trade Scheme was written there in plain black ink, approved 14 days ahead of the standard review timeline, in exchange for a private payment routed through a banking house in Amsterdam. When Octavia held that document in her hands for the first time, sitting in Lady Prudence's back study on a Tuesday evening with rain hitting the window, she did not feel triumph. Not yet. She felt the weight of it. The real, physical weight of what a piece of paper could do when it contained the right words in the right order. She was 6 weeks away from the 8-month mark Dorian had set for the annulment. She had perhaps 6 weeks to decide how to use everything she had built. She thought about it for one night. Only one. Then she wrote a letter to a journalist. His name was Mr. Frederick Quill, and he wrote for a publication called The London Examiner, which was not the most prestigious paper in the city, but was the most widely read below a certain social level, meaning it reached merchants, tradesmen, clerks, and the kind of people who formed public opinion from the ground up rather than the top down. Frederick Quill had a reputation for being ungovernable, the sort of writer who had been threatened with legal action 4 times and had won or survived each one. He was also, according to Lady Prudence, the man who had exposed a fraudulent charity connected to a duke's household 3 years ago, and he had done it with such precision that the duke in question had been socially finished within a fortnight. Octavia did not give him everything. She gave him enough to be interesting. The Eastern trade venture, the licensing irregularity, the name Grendel, framed as a question worth investigating rather than a statement of fact. She kept Dorian's name out of it entirely for now. She wanted the outer walls to fall before she touched the centre. Quill replied within 48 hours. He wanted to meet. They met in the lending library on Clement Street, because by now Mrs. Harriet Soane's back room had become something of an operations point, and Harriet herself had become something of an ally, a woman who asked few questions and remembered every answer. Quill was short, red-haired, with restless eyes that moved around a room the way a chess player's eyes move around a board, always 3 moves ahead. He shook Octavia's hand the way he would shake a man's, which she appreciated. "You understand," she said, "that my name does not appear anywhere." "Understood," he said. "And you understand that what I have given you is a thread, not a story, the story you build yourself." "That is how all the best stories work," he said, and smiled in a way that confirmed Lady Prudence's assessment of him entirely. He left with the thread. Octavia left with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just set something in motion that could not be stopped. She returned to Ashmere Hall that evening, in time for dinner. Dorian was there, and Lenora was still in residence, her fortnight extended by another fortnight, because of course it had been. The 3 of them sat at the long table and performed the ritual of a meal, and Octavia was so composed, so pleasant, so entirely unreadable, that when Dorian glanced at her between courses, he saw exactly what he had always seen: a quiet woman, a placeholder, a problem already solved. He raised his glass. She raised hers. He had no idea he was toasting his own destruction. The article appeared in the London Examiner on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after Octavia's meeting with Frederick Quill. It did not mention the Duke of Ashmere. It did not need to. It asked, in Quill's sharp and deceptively casual style, why a senior member of the Board of Trade had approved a major Eastern commerce licence 14 days ahead of the standard review process, and whether the banking transfer routed through Amsterdam in the same month was connected to that approval, and whether the gentleman responsible for overseeing such licences might care to explain the discrepancy to the public that trusted them with that responsibility. Lord Hamish Grendel read the article at his breakfast table and reportedly knocked his coffee to the floor. By noon, the article had been passed between hands in 3 different clubs on St. James's Street. By evening, it had reached the offices of 2 members of Parliament who had been looking for exactly this kind of opening in a completely unrelated political dispute, and recognised immediately how useful it could become. By the following morning, Lord Grendel had sent a private message to Dorian through a mutual contact, and the message was not polite. Octavia knew all of this before Dorian did, because Mrs. Ines Alcott had contacts in 2 of those clubs, and Portia Grimes had contacts in the house of the mutual contact. And information moved through women's networks the way water moves through old stone, finding every crack. She was in the library reading when Dorian came to find her. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before he reached the door, heavier and faster than his usual controlled pace. She did not look up from her book when he entered. "Are you aware," he said, closing the door behind him, "of an article in the Examiner this morning?" "I do not take the Examiner," she said pleasantly. "Is it interesting?" He looked at her. She turned a page. "It concerns a trade licensing matter," he said carefully. "How dull," she said, "though I suppose those things matter to people in business." Another long look. She could feel it on the side of her face like heat from a candle held too close. She did not turn. She kept her eyes on the page, even though she had not absorbed a single word of it. He left without saying anything more. The moment the door closed, she exhaled slowly and set the book down. He did not know, not yet, but he was beginning to feel it, the way you feel weather changing before the sky shows you anything. The instinct of a man who had survived by being alert to threat, suddenly registering that something in his environment had shifted and he could not locate the source. Good. Let him feel it without understanding it. That was the most useful phase. the phase where he would make mistakes. He made the first one 4 days later. Dorian called a private meeting at the estate with Percival Galt, and a man Octavia had not seen before, a solicitor named Mr. Brand Callum, thin and severe, with the energy of someone perpetually bracing for disaster. They met in Dorian's study with the doors closed, and they believed no possibility of being overheard. They had not considered the matter of the study's ventilation grate, which connected to a passage behind the east wall that had been built into the original house 2 centuries ago, for purposes no one currently remembered and no one currently thought about, except for Betsy, the maid, who had mentioned it once in passing conversation as the place where the cold air came from in winter. Octavia had thought about it very carefully. She heard enough. The plan had changed. The 8-month annulment timeline was being compressed. Dorian wanted the marriage dissolved in 4 months rather than 8, because the Grendel situation was creating pressure he had not anticipated, and he needed his financial position fully consolidated before any official inquiry got close enough to examine the Eastern trade venture itself. Mr. Brand Callum advised caution. Percival advised speed. Dorian agreed with Percival, as he always did when Percival told him what he wanted to hear. They also discussed Octavia directly. Percival said she seemed harmless enough. Callum said he had made inquiries and found no evidence of any unusual correspondence leaving the estate. Dorian said she was exactly what he had expected. Quiet, contained, no trouble. They all agreed that the annulment could be filed on grounds of failure to fulfill marital duties, a phrase that made Octavia's jaw tighten so hard she felt it in her back teeth, and that the grounds would be difficult to contest without legal representation, which she could not secure without funds, which she would not have access to once the estate transfer was completed. They had thought of everything, or they believed they had. They had not thought of Lady Gwen Thurston, who had already frozen the estate transfer through a legal query that was sitting on a clerk's desk in the Court of Chancery, waiting to become a formal objection the moment Octavia gave the word. She gave the word the next morning. Lady Gwen filed the formal objection by Thursday. By Friday, the Crane estate deed transfer was officially suspended pending review. The intermediary firm Dorian had used received a notice requiring documentation of their authority to act on behalf of the estate. Documentation they could not produce because it did not exist in the form required, because Octavia had never properly authorized it, because the marriage ceremony itself had been structured in a way that Dorian's solicitor had assumed covered the transfer of assets, but which, under a specific reading of the married women's property considerations that Lady Gwen knew better than anyone, it did not. It was a thread, a small, technical thread, but it was enough to hold everything still while Octavia pulled the larger ones. Dorian discovered the suspension on a Monday. She heard it from Portia Grimes before he had even left his study. By the time he appeared at lunch, his composure was back in place, but there were marks around it, the way a painting shows cracks when the surface underneath shifts. He was very controlled, very measured, and he looked at her across the table with eyes that were no longer dismissive. Something had changed in the way he saw her. She could feel it. He did not know what he was looking at yet, but he knew he had been looking at the wrong thing. "How are you finding London?" he asked. It was an odd question. He had never asked her about London before. "I find it very interesting," she said. "There is always more to it than you expect." He nodded slowly. "You have been going out more. The carriage has been used several times this month." "You said I could attend social engagements," she said lightly. "I have been taking advantage of your generosity." "Of course," he said. Neither of them said anything else. But something had entered the room that had not been there before. Not warmth. Something more complicated than warmth. The beginning of him recognizing that he was in a contest he had not prepared for, because he had not known he was in one. That same week, Lenora Voss came to find Octavia. It was unexpected. Octavia had anticipated many things, but not this. She was in the garden when Leonora appeared at the gate in the stone wall that separated the formal garden from the kitchen grounds, and for a moment the two women simply looked at each other across the cold autumn air. Leonora spoke first. "I know what he did," she said. "I know why he married you." Octavia studied her. "Did he tell you?" "Percival told me. Last night. He thought it was funny." Leonora's expression was very still, but her voice had a shake in it that she was working hard to control. "He said Dorian had chosen the most forgettable woman in England, so that no one would notice when she was put aside." The words landed. Octavia let them. She had known them for months, but hearing them spoken aloud in another woman's voice gave them a different texture. "Why are you telling me this?" Octavia asked. "Because I am not proud of what I have been part of," Leonora said. "I did not arrange this, but I allowed it. I told myself it was not my business how he managed his affairs. And that was cowardice." She paused. "I want to leave. I have wanted to leave for 2 weeks. But I do not have the money to go home, and going home only means returning to my father's debts anyway." Octavia was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the garden. Dead leaves crossed the path between them. "If you were to write down everything Percival told you," Octavia said slowly, "everything he said about the plan, the annulment, the estate transfer, and if you signed it in front of a witness, it would constitute a formal testimony. It would be admissible." Leonora stared at her. "You have been building a case." "I have been building several," Octavia said. Another silence. Then Leonora said, very quietly, "I thought you would hate me." "I do not have time to hate you," Octavia said. "I have work to do. But if you want to be useful, I will find a use for you. And when this is over, I will make sure you have enough to go wherever you want to go." Leonora nodded. Her eyes were bright, but her chin was steady. They walked back into the house together through the garden door, and if any member of the staff saw them and found it unusual, no one said so. Mrs. Portia Grimes saw them from the kitchen window and allowed herself a very small smile before returning to her work. By the end of that week, Octavia had Leonora's signed testimony in her possession, witnessed by Lady Gwen Thurston's barrister brother, a quiet man named Mr. Arthur Thurston, who asked no unnecessary questions and charged a very reasonable fee. She had the ministry document from Mrs. Ines Alcott. She had the frozen estate transfer. She had the testimony. She had Silas Dray's documented evidence of the contract manipulation. She had René Colbert's quiet cooperation and the letters he had made available to her, which she had copied in her own hand onto fresh paper, dates and all, keeping the originals safe in a locked case that she had given to Mrs. Harriet Soane's lending library for safekeeping. She had, in 6 weeks of quiet and apparently unremarkable activity, constructed a case that would take a trained barrister months to assemble. And she had done it while attending dinner every evening, asking polite questions about the weather, and being exactly the placeholder her husband believed she was. Frederick Quill sent her a note through Harriet Soane. He had found more. The Amsterdam banking house had connections to 2 other ventures under Grendel's oversight, both of which bore the same fingerprints. He was preparing a second article. He wanted to know how much further he should go. She wrote back 2 words. All of it. She was ready. Every piece was in place. Every door was unlocked. Every witness was positioned. The only thing left was the moment itself, the ballroom, the dagger, the letter, the silence. But before that moment could arrive, Dorian made his final move. She returned to the estate on a Thursday evening to find her rooms had been searched. It had been done carefully, professionally even, but she knew her own space the way she knew her own handwriting. The books were replaced a fraction out of alignment. The writing desk drawer had been opened and closed. The trunk at the foot of the bed, had been shifted 2 inches to the left. He knew something. Not everything, but enough to be frightened. And frightened men who held power did not wait quietly for the ground to finish moving beneath them. They acted. She sat on the edge of her bed and breathed carefully for 1 minute. Then she stood, picked up her small travelling case, the one she had kept packed for 3 weeks for exactly this contingency, and went to find Portia Grimes. "Tonight," she said. Portia nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that word for weeks. Because she had. Octavia left Ashmere Hall that night through the kitchen entrance, with Sam Ellery driving a plain carriage that was registered in Thomas Wick's name and therefore untraceable to her. She did not look back at the house as they pulled away. She had nothing left to take from it. Everything she needed was already waiting for her in London. She stayed at Lady Prudence's townhouse on Cavendish Square, not as a guest, as a general preparing for the final engagement of a long campaign. The back study became her war room. The oval table that Lady Prudence usually reserved for her salon gatherings became the surface on which Octavia spread every document, every letter, every copy, every signed testimony, and every piece of evidence she had gathered across 4 months of patient, invisible work. The women came the next morning, all 5 of them. Mrs. Cordelia Ames arrived first, before 8, still in her outdoor coat with a folder of Treasury correspondence under her arm. Miss Daphne Strayle came next with updated survey maps. Lady Gwen Thurston arrived with her brother Arthur, who had apparently decided that this particular matter warranted his direct involvement rather than just a signature, Mrs. Inez Alcott came last, quiet as always, and placed a second ministry document on the table without saying a word, one that connected Grendel's irregular approval not just to Dorian's Eastern venture, but to a previous scheme 3 years earlier that had collapsed and ruined 4 smaller investors who had never received an explanation. Octavia looked at everything spread across that table and felt the full architecture of it for the first time. From the outside it looked like chaos, letters and maps and ledger copies and sworn statements. From the inside it was a building, every piece load-bearing, every connection deliberate. Frederick Quill arrived at 10. He was shown into the study by Lady Prudence's butler, who had by this point grown so accustomed to unusual visitors that he had stopped raising his eyebrows entirely. Quill looked at the table and let out a low breath. "You built all of this," he said. It was not quite a question. "We built it," Octavia said, and meant it. He sat down, and they worked through the morning. The second article was already written. The third was outlined. Quill had, in his own parallel investigation, found 2 former employees of the Amsterdam banking house who were willing to provide statements about the nature of the transfers. Not signed testimony admissible in court, but enough for publication, enough to make the story impossible to dismiss as speculation. He had also found, through a connection in the shipping industry, evidence that the Eastern trade venture itself had been misrepresented to its minor investors, 3 merchants who had each put in several £100s on the basis of projected returns that Dorian's own internal documents showed he knew were inflated. 3 ordinary men, not lords, not politicians, merchants with families and ledger books and losses they could not afford. When Octavia heard their names, she wrote them down carefully and set that paper apart from the rest. Those 3 men mattered, not just as evidence, as people. She asked Quill to find their addresses. He did, by the following afternoon. She wrote each of them a personal letter, not as the Duchess of Ashmere, but as the daughter of Baron Crane, identifying herself only by that name, explaining that she was aware of their losses and that she believed a path existed to recover what they were owed, and that if they were willing to submit formal complaints through a legal channel, she would provide at no cost to them. Their names would be added to a case that was already in motion. All 3 replied within the week. All 3 agreed. Arthur Thurston, Lady Gwen's brother, added their complaints to the growing legal structure he was assembling. which had by now expanded beyond a simple property challenge into something closer to a formal suit on multiple grounds: contract fraud, asset misrepresentation, procedural corruption in the licensing process, and the improper filing of the Crane estate deed transfer. It was not one case. It was 5, braided together so tightly that pulling any single thread would tighten all the others. Meanwhile, Dorian was looking for her. She knew this because Sam Ellery, who had returned to the estate after delivering her safely to Cavendish Square, sent word through Thomas Wick that the Duke had questioned the staff about her whereabouts, that Percival Galt had visited twice in the days following her departure, and that Mr. Brand Callum, the solicitor, had been summoned to the estate and had stayed for an entire day. She also knew, through Portia Grimes, who had remained at the hall and was now functioning as the most effective intelligence source Octavia had ever had access to, that Dorian had sent inquiries to 2 coaching inns and 1 private hotel in London trying to locate his wife. He had not thought to inquire at Lady Prudence Fairfax's townhouse on Cavendish Square. Lady Prudence was not the kind of woman men thought of when they were looking for a runaway wife. She was too old, too established, too much a fixture of the acceptable social landscape to seem like a hiding place, which was precisely what made her so effective as one. Lenora Voss had also left the estate. She had gone quietly the day after Octavia, telling no one her destination. She had, however, left a note for Dorian on his writing desk. Octavia did not know exactly what the note said, but Portia reported that Dorian had read it standing up and then remained very still for a long time afterward. Good, let him be still. Let him stand in his empty house with his plans unraveling and his carefully maintained world going quiet around him. Let him feel exactly what she had felt on her first night in the East Wing, the cold, specific silence of a place where no one was coming to help you. On the 12th day after leaving Ashmere Hall, Frederick Quill's second article appeared in the London Examiner. This one was not a question, it was a statement. It named Lord Hamish Grendel directly. It detailed the Amsterdam transfer with dates and amounts. It described the inflated projections given to the 3 merchant investors, naming the venture but not yet its principal backer. It included a quoted statement from one of the former banking house employees in Amsterdam, and it ended with a paragraph that noted, in Quill's precise and devastating way, that the principal beneficiary of the irregular licensing approval was a titled individual whose identity the paper was currently investigating and would name in a forthcoming edition once all verification was complete. London read it over breakfast and talked about it through dinner. By the afternoon, Lord Grendel had issued a denial through his secretary. By the evening, 2 members of Parliament had called for a formal inquiry. By the following morning, the denial had made things worse, because it contained a specific denial of a detail that had not actually appeared in the article, which told every careful reader that Grendel knew more about what was coming than a truly innocent man would have reason to know. Octavia read the parliamentary coverage in Lady Prudence's morning room with a cup of tea and the focused calm of someone watching a structure they designed performing exactly as intended. Lady Prudence watched her from across the room. "You know," the older woman said, "I have sat in this house for 40 years watching powerful men burn down things other people built. It is very satisfying to finally watch it work the other direction." Octavia looked up. "It is not finished yet." "No," Lady Prudence agreed. "But the best part is coming. The best part required one more thing. It required Dorian himself to make a public move. Because everything Octavia had built, the legal case, the ministry document, the testimony, the articles, was powerful in its accumulation, but still operating at a distance from him. His name had not appeared in print. Arthur Thurston's legal filings were in the Court of Chancery and not yet public record. He still had room to manoeuvre, to negotiate privately, to make deals that might soften the impact before it became fully visible. She needed him to step forward. She needed him to appear in a room where she controlled the walls. She sent him a letter, not through a solicitor, not through an intermediary, directly, in her own handwriting, on paper that carried no address, but that she knew Portia would ensure reached him through channels he trusted. The letter was short. It said that she wished to discuss the terms of a private settlement before the matter, currently before the Court of Chancery, became a matter of public record. It said she would be attending Lord and Lady Brentwood's winter ball on Saturday evening as Lady Prudence's guest. It said she hoped they might speak. It was polite. It was measured. It sounded exactly like a woman looking for a quiet exit. He came. Of course he came. Because he still believed, somewhere beneath the anxiety of the last 2 weeks, that she was manageable. That she was the quiet, bookish, forgettable woman he had selected because she would not fight. He came because he thought he could negotiate her back into silence. He came because men like Dorian Ashcroft had spent their entire lives being able to do exactly that. Say the right thing, apply the right pressure, and watch the problem resolve. He walked into the Brentwood ballroom on Saturday evening and found his wife standing at the centre of it, like she had always been meant to stand there. The Brentwood ball was the largest social event of the winter season. Lord and Lady Brentwood were among the most connected hosts in London, their guest list a careful cross-section of the political, financial and aristocratic worlds. There were members of Parliament, senior trade officials, newspaper editors, 3 judges, and enough titled witnesses to make anything that happened in that room permanently and irrevocably part of the public record of London society. Lady Prudence had chosen the venue. Of course she had. Octavia arrived early enough to know the room before it filled. She stood near the centre, close to the long table that ran beneath the chandeliers, and she watched each guest arrive with the steady attention of someone who had spent 4 months learning to see everything. She wore no particular expression. She was simply present in the way that a storm is present before it breaks, felt before it is seen. Mrs. Cordelia Ames was there with her husband, positioned near the group of parliamentary men. Mrs. Inez Alcott stood near the door to the reading room with 2 women Octavia did not know but recognised by type, senior, composed, people who held records in their heads. Lady Gwen Thurston was across the room with Arthur, who had brought, in a slim leather case under his arm, a complete copy of every legal filing currently before the Court of Chancery. Frederick Quill was not a guest. He was outside, in a carriage on the street, with a messenger boy ready to carry a copy to the Examiner's night editor the moment Octavia's signal reached him through Lady Prudence's footman. Miss Daphne Strayle was also not inside. She was at a private address 2 streets away, with the original documents, keeping them safe. Everything was positioned. Everyone knew their role. Percival Galt arrived before Dorian, which Octavia had expected. Percival moved through the room with his habitual ease, shaking hands and accepting a glass of champagne, and then his eyes found her across the crowd, and the ease left his face very suddenly. He crossed to her quickly. "What are you doing here?" he said, keeping his voice low and his smile fixed for the benefit of anyone watching. "Attending a ball," she said pleasantly, "as one does. Dorian is coming tonight. You should not be here." "I know he is coming," she said. "I invited him." Percival's fixed smile cracked just slightly. "What are you talking about?" "I have a message for you as well, actually," she said, reaching into her glove and producing a single folded sheet. "This is a copy of a letter you wrote to Dorian in October, the one in which you referred to me as the most economical solution to a problem that would otherwise have required actual effort." She held it out. He did not take it. "I have the original, and 11 others very much like it. They are currently being reviewed by a barrister and will be submitted as supporting evidence in the proceedings before the Court of Chancery." I thought you should know. Percival stared at her. The champagne glass in his hand tilted slightly. You should probably get some air, she said kindly. You look unwell. He moved away from her through the crowd, and she watched him go with the calm satisfaction of someone who has done a difficult thing correctly. Dorian arrived 20 minutes later. He entered the ballroom with the controlled authority of a man who owned most rooms he walked into. He was dressed precisely, carried himself with the particular uprightness of someone managing internal tension through external discipline, and his eyes found Octavia within seconds of his arrival. He crossed to her steadily, and she watched him come, and she thought about the Thursday wedding, and the grey rain, and the priest who had wanted to be somewhere else, and she felt nothing for this man except a clear, clean resolve that had been 4 months in the building. He stopped in front of her. You look well, he said. It was all he could think of to say. I am very well, she said. Thank you for coming. You said you wished to discuss a settlement. I did say that, she agreed. But I want to be honest with you, Dorian. That was not entirely accurate. What I actually wanted was for you to come to this room in front of these people, so that what happens next happens where it cannot be undone. He looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite fear yet. The precursor to it. What are you doing? He said quietly. She reached into her glove and removed the folded letter, not a copy. The original, on ministry paper, with the date and the amount and the name of the Amsterdam banking house and the name of Lord Hamish Grendel and the name of the Duke of Ashmere's Eastern trade venture, all in plain black ink, witnessed and authenticated by Mrs. Inez Olcott's sources. She held it up between 2 fingers so that anyone nearby could see she was holding a document, though only he could see what it contained. This is a ministry record, she said. It documents an irregular licensing approval obtained through a payment routed through Amsterdam. It names the venture it benefited. It names you. She paused. Arthur Thurston is filing it in court on Monday morning. Frederick Quill is writing about it tonight. The 3 merchants your inflated projections defrauded have submitted formal complaints. Silas Dray's legal team has been given the contract documentation, and Lenora Voss has signed a testimony describing a conversation in which the entire plan, the marriage, the estate transfer, the annulment, was described to her by Percival Galt in explicit detail. The room moved around them, music played somewhere, crystal clinked, people laughed. And in the middle of all of it, the Duke of Ashmere stood very still while his wife quietly, methodically, and completely dismantled everything he had built. You cannot do this, he said. His voice was very low. I have already done it, she said. Every piece is already in motion. I am not threatening you. I am informing you. There is a difference. Then she did the thing she had planned last but felt most. She drove the small decorative letter knife she had taken from Lady Prudence's writing desk into the surface of the table beside them, not violently, not dramatically, but with a precise and deliberate pressure that made a sound sharp enough to turn heads in a radius of 10 feet. The music did not stop, but the conversations nearest to them did. And in that pocket of sudden quiet, with the candlelight catching the fire in her eyes, and the Duke of Ashmere's face gone the colour of old paper, Octavia said, clearly enough to be heard by the people closest to them, who would tell others still, in the way that London always made sure the right information reached the right ears by morning, I was married to be erased, Your Grace. I trust you can see how that has worked out. He had no answer. For the first time in his life, Dorian Ashcroft, Duke of Ashmere, stood in a room full of his own kind and had nothing to say. He left the ball within the hour. Percival had already gone. Frederick Quill's 3rd article ran on Monday. It named the Duke of Ashmere. It was thorough, evidenced, and carefully worded enough to be legally defensible and publicly devastating in equal measure. By Tuesday, it had been referenced in Parliament. By Wednesday, Lord Grendel had resigned his position on the Board of Trade and issued a statement that, in trying to minimise his own role, inadvertently confirmed several details about Dorian's involvement that Dorian had hoped to dispute. The Court of Chancery suspended the Eastern Trade Ventures licensing pending review. The Crane estate deed transfer was formally invalidated. Arthur Thurston filed for full restitution on behalf of the 3 defrauded merchants. Silas Dray's legal claim was reinstated with the contract documentation Octavia had provided, and his barrister described the new evidence as more than sufficient. Dorian's solicitor attempted to file the annulment on the grounds they had planned. The filing was returned on procedural grounds because Octavia had, through Arthur Thurston, preemptively filed her own petition citing desertion of marital duty, financial fraud within the marriage, and conduct unbecoming, a filing that had priority and that rendered Dorian's filing secondary and subject to the outcome of the broader legal proceedings. Brand Callum, the severe solicitor, resigned from the matter the following week, citing a conflict of interest that everyone understood meant he had no interest in going down with the ship. What happened to Dorian in the months that followed was not sudden. It was thorough. His club membership was quietly suspended pending the outcome of the court proceedings. 3 of his financial backers withdrew from the Eastern trade venture within a fortnight of the 3rd article. The estate remained his in name while the legal process ran, but its operations were frozen, its accounts under scrutiny, and its owner subject to the specific social death that London administered to men who had been publicly and irrefutably exposed, not the dramatic fall, but the slow and total withdrawal of every room that had previously welcomed them. Percival Gault left for the continent. He sent Dorian a brief letter of apology that was, by all accounts, almost entirely about himself. Lenora Voss used the sum Octavia had arranged for her through Mr. Cornelius Webb to travel to Edinburgh, where she had a cousin, and to begin a life that had nothing to do with any of them. She wrote Octavia one letter before she left. It said only, "I hope you know what you have done. Not what you have won. What you have done. There is a difference, and it is the better one." Octavia kept that letter. It was the one she read again, later, when everything had settled and the legal proceedings had run their course, and the city had moved on to its next scandal, as cities always do. She sat in the library of Crane Estate, restored to her name and her possession, with a fire going and a book open on her lap that she was not reading, and she thought about the Thursday wedding and the thin rain and the choice she had made to see rather than to weep. She had not set out to become anything in particular. She had simply refused to become nothing. But London had its own way of naming things, and what London named her, in the drawing rooms and the clubs and the newspaper columns that referenced the case for years afterward, was dangerous. The most dangerous woman in London, they said, not because she had wielded violence or scandal for its own sake, but because she had done something far more threatening to the men who had underestimated her. She had paid attention, she had remembered everything, and when the moment came, she had been completely, immovably ready. Mrs. Portia Grimes came to work for her at Crane Estate and brought Betsy with her, who had stopped dropping things and apologising and had developed, under Octavia's roof, a quietly formidable efficiency that made visiting guests slightly nervous in the best possible way. Thomas Wick and Sam Ellery stayed on as groundsmen. Mr. Aldous Fitch retired to his sister's house in Bath, which everyone agreed was the right outcome for all parties. René Colbert returned to Lyon with enough money to keep his mother comfortable, and a reference letter from Lady Prudence Fairfax that could open doors in any house in Europe. Lady Prudence hosted a dinner in Octavia's honour at Cavendish Square. On the evening the Court of Chancery issued its final ruling. There were 12 women around the table, including the original 5, and several others who had contributed in ways large and small to what had been built over those 4 months. There were no speeches. Lady Prudence did not believe in speeches. There was excellent food, honest conversation, and at one point near the end of the evening, a moment of very genuine laughter that rang through the townhouse and out into the square, where the winter air caught it and carried it off into the dark London night. Frederick Quill wrote one final piece about the matter, not an exposé, but something closer to a reflection, published on a quiet Tuesday morning. He described it as the most significant legal and social unraveling of a single act of deliberate marital fraud that London had witnessed in a generation. He did not name Octavia as his source. He described her only as a woman who had arrived in London's most dangerous circles with nothing but clarity and patience, and had left them with everything she was owed. She read it at breakfast. She set it down. She poured herself another cup of tea. Outside the window, London was doing what London always did, moving, breathing, plotting, laughing, suffering, and rising again. The whole enormous, imperfect engine of it turning through another morning without pausing for anyone. Octavia Crane, formerly the Duchess of Ashmere, once chosen to disappear, looked out at it with clear eyes and felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, entirely and completely at home. She had not been erased. She had been revealed. And London, in its long memory and its love of a story worth telling, would not forget her. Now, tell us honestly, did you ever think Octavia would let them win? At what moment did you feel her power the most? Drop your answer in the comments and let us know where you are watching from. If this story moved you, if Octavia's journey gave you chills, please hit the subscribe button right now. There is so much more coming, and every single one of you watching makes this worth building. Thank you for being here.